The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Hello and welcome. Welcome to the program called Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Claire Hall. I'm your host, and if you've been joining us for this weekly chat for a while, you know I like to talk about a lot of different things, but the two subjects I keep returning to over and over are the greatest sport in the world, baseball, and just the greatest creation of humankind, in my humble opinion, the book. So when I get to talk to authors of baseball books, you know, that's always a treat. But today I'm talking to a man who has written a book about my all-time favorite baseball writer, Roger Angell. And pleased to welcome to the program today, Joe Bonomo. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Claire.
How are you today?
Just great. How are you?
Doing great. Here in Oregon, where I'm recording, it looks like the first sunny and nice day in about 2 weeks. So going to really enjoy a little time outdoors before the sun sets.
That's great. I can say the same thing about northern Illinois, where I am. It's been gray and gray, but the sun is coming out today, so that changes everything, doesn't it?
Hey, it really does. It really does. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional background, and then we'll lead up to how you came to write this book.
I'm a professor of English at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb. I've been here for many years. I teach creative nonfiction, creative writing workshops, and memoir and autobiography. But I've also have written several books about music, starting with my first called Sweat, about the garage rock band the Fleshtones, and I've written books about Jerry Lee Lewis and AC/DC, and a couple books of collections of my essays. Most recently, a book called Field Recordings from the Inside, a collection of my music essays. I write 2 music essays a year for the Normal School literary magazine, but no such thing no place I'd rather be, is my first baseball book, which I was very, very happy to get the opportunity to write.
So tell us how that came about, or why you were interested or sought the opportunity to write about Roger Angell.
Well, I've been a fan for a long, long time. I first discovered his book Late Innings when I was a teenager. It was on my dad's bookshelf, who is also a fan of Angell. And I just fell in love with his writing about the game from that early age. And I've been a fan of baseball since I was a kid. So I was just getting into reading and to literature and to books. It was a wonderful time to discover Angell, who really brings such a wonderful literary sensibility to writing about the game. So I've been a fan for many, many years, for decades now. And it occurred to me a few years back that he deserves a book about his career and about his writing. I like to write books about subjects that I want to know more about, that I'm curious about. And I've been so just blown away by Angell's writing about baseball, so I thought it would be a great opportunity to be able to put it all into sort of a context and to tell the story about Angell. Quite frankly, there's no one like him. There was no one writing about baseball anymore the way Roger Angell still does, although he's slowed down considerably. He's approaching his 100th birthday, after all.
Yeah, I was going to say he will be 100 in September, so I guess we can give him a pass on slowing down a little bit. But just frankly, what impresses me, about many things about him, and I'm sure you'd agree, is how his mind and has remained totally acute into his 90s. And his passion for the game. He seems to me to write about the game today with just as much passion and insight as he did in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, you're right. It's one of the remarkable things about him. And I think it's also one of the great strengths of his writing is that he's able, of course, as a person, to plug himself back into the joys of the game, the eternal rhythms of the game, what he loved about baseball since he was a teenager when he first fell in love with it, but it also informs his writing because he is always still writing about the fact that baseball amazes him, that baseball surprises him, he's still struck by how baseball can be a marvelous game and a surprising game, and he recognizes that his writing is a way for him to explore the fact that baseball is still a renewable game for him, even this late in his life.
That is fantastic. And again, the title of the book is No Place I Would Rather Be, Roger Angell and a Life in Baseball Writing. We're talking to the author, Joe Bonomo, and you're published by University of Nebraska Press. So I'm assuming people can obtain the book, hopefully in their local bookstore if they have one, but online through various online booksellers or directly from the publisher?
That's right.
So we would like to maybe go back and just, if there might be somebody listening who doesn't know about this remarkable man, and even though, you've said this is not a comprehensive biography, you certainly do give us the structure of his life story and his working career, especially up to the 1960s when he really began to focus on writing about baseball.
Yeah, I should begin, or I should add that when I decided to write this book, of course, the first person, obviously, I wanted to speak to was Roger, not only because I'm an enormous fan, but because I also wanted to sort of run the project past him and get his blessing if I could. I wanted it to be an authorized book, but he made it very clear to me from the beginning that he did not want a conventional biography to be written about him. That's not something he's interested in having done. He's a fairly private man, a reserved man at any rate. And I think he figured that all of the autobiographical, personal writing he wanted to do, he's done in his last couple of books, which are collections of his autobiographical pieces. But once I assured him that wasn't the book I had in mind, he was very grateful, finally, that I was doing this, and he gave me his blessing and was very happy that the book was happening. And I realized soon after that I kind of needed his blessing in order for his colleagues and his former colleagues at the New Yorker magazine to talk to him. Once they found out that he was on board, then everyone was eager to talk to me because they, like me, felt that this book was sort of long overdue.
Well, that's great. And maybe just to take it back to his childhood, his mother and stepfather were certainly two of the greatest names in the history of the New Yorker.
Yeah, his mother was Catherine Sargent Angell, and her second husband was E.B. White, the amazing writer and essayist who worked at the New Yorker magazine and Harper's magazine and other places for many years. And Catherine was the first fiction editor at the New Yorker. So Roger really grew up kind of inside, figuratively speaking, inside the magazine. It was talked about at home all the time. He was mostly raised by his father, Catherine's first husband, who was a lawyer himself and ended up heading the New York chapter of the ACLU. But he did go up to Maine regularly, where his mother and his stepfather, E.B. White, lived, and really was surrounded by words and surrounded by language and literature, and very much grew up sort of in the shadow of the New Yorker. So it made a kind of a logical sense that he would eventually start writing for the magazine himself.
Yeah, the book, I too am a lifelong fan of his work, or I'm going to say at least since my teen years. I just turned 60 a few months ago, and I got spoiled. I think the first three serious baseball books I read were The Glory of Their Times, The Long Season, and then the very first collection of Angell's New Yorker pieces, The Summer Game. Right. But one thing I somehow I imagined him having these long tutorials with E.B. White about the art and craft of nonfiction, but this is my words, not yours. But I think alluding back to what you've just said, it's really that really didn't happen. It was more almost osmosis, just growing up in that atmosphere, watching his mother at work, watching his stepfather at work, and the kinds of things they did and the books they surrounded themselves with. Do you think that's a fair way to characterize his early years?
Oh, it sure is. We have to remember Roger is just a natively gifted writer, regardless of who his mom was, regardless of who his stepfather was. He was destined to be a great writer. He just took a while to find his subject, which turned out to be baseball. But yeah, he he and his stepfather, E.B. White, apparently talked very rarely about writing. And the greatest influence that White had on Roger was by example. He would hole himself away in his writing room all day long, come out for lunch, come out at the end of the afternoon sort of looking worried, afraid that he had failed again, or that the essay or whatever it was he was working on wasn't as great as he wanted it to be. And Roger kind of, like osmosis, really absorbed that writing ethic, and that his mother exhibited as well. So the two of them were just a tremendous influence on Roger in terms of the work required and the commitment required to be a great writer. They were wonderful examples of that.
And you mentioned it did take him a while to find his subject, and it may surprise some people who think of him solely as a baseball writer, is that throughout, I guess, the 1940s and even well into the 50s, he was doing fiction of all kind, although a few baseball pieces. He did a few humorous pieces. One of the favorites on my bookshelf is called A Day in the Life of Roger Angell, which is a wonderful parody of Jim Bishop's books. I don't know if people remember Jim Bishop, but he was well known for chronicling historical days of great significance in minute detail, and Roger just does a spot-on parody of that. But maybe talk a little bit about his evolution as a writer and what finally led him to the focus on baseball.
Yeah, well, he graduated from Harvard and started to look for work, as you do. But he was essentially had convinced himself, or believed very strongly, that he was going to be a serious fiction writer. And so he devoted the first decade or so after graduating from from college and even beyond, to devoting himself to writing short stories, many of which appeared in the New Yorker magazine in the 40s and the 50s, and were eventually collected in his first book called The Stone Arbor and Other Stories that came out in 1960, which was received well, was well reviewed. But around that time, as he told me, and he's gone on record saying otherwise, he began to lose interest in fiction. He didn't think that he finally had too many other stories to tell. Now, we have to remember that he was also, since 1956, a fiction editor at the New Yorker magazine.
Following in his mother's footsteps.
Following in his mother's footsteps, exactly. This is an aspect of Roger's career. David Remnick, the current New Yorker editor, has said that Roger was one of the great fiction editors of the 20th century. This was a quieter work, less public work, but he discovered a number of very well-known writers. And so, although he had stopped writing fiction by the late 50s, he had just begun actually to edit stories for the magazine. So he always was devoted to short fiction for the bulk of his career. But a couple years after that book appeared, he began writing about the baseball in earnest for the New Yorker magazine. There were a few short stories devoted to or about baseball. Before he joined the New Yorker in 1956, he was an editor at Holiday magazine, a kind of a splashy travel magazine modeled on Life magazine, and he wrote a couple long pieces on baseball for that magazine, and a couple of comments pieces, those small sort of fun pieces in the first opening pages of the New Yorker magazine, talk of the town pieces about baseball. But he hadn't really discovered baseball as a subject he wanted to devote his writing life to until he was in his early 40s, amazingly, until 1962.
Right, when he went down to spring training to chronicle the birth of the Mets, really, wasn't it?
That's exactly right. His editor at the time, William Shawn, wanted to get some more sports writing in the magazine. They'd done football and boxing and hockey and tennis, but no one was really writing long pieces about baseball. And as Roger has said many times, William Shawn's greatness as an editor stemmed from the fact that he always encouraged his writers to follow their bliss, as it were, to write about what they cared about and what they were deeply curious about and wanted to learn more about. And as is also famous in the New Yorker, Shawn gave his writers as much space and as much time as they needed. And that's really what marks Angell's baseball writing is different from almost all other men and women who have devoted their professional lives to writing about baseball, is that he wrote, luckily, happily, coincidentally, for a magazine that gave him all the space he needed. He wasn't sort of pegged to journalistic deadlines and the small sort of column width of newspapers, and even some of
didn't have to churn out 750 words on deadline 3 or 5 times a week.
Exactly. If he wanted to churn out 75,000 words, he could have done it. And some of his, as we know, those of us who love his work, his baseball essays, which appeared 3 times a year, basically. He would do a spring training and then a midsummer and then a sort of a postseason recap piece. Those in the 70s and the 80s were 30 pages each.
Oh, yeah, and every word a delight. Mm-hmm.
Every word a delight. Every word.
Yes,
smart. Yep.
Yes. I mean, I'm trying to think of favorites in my own mind, and that's so hard to choose. But I'll say one piece, one of his many great pieces, but just stands out in my mind after the inexplicable quick decline that Pirates pitcher Steve Blass suffered in the 70s within a couple of years, going from being one of the top pitchers in the game to being completely out of the game, and getting him to sit down and pitch essentially an imaginary game and take him through against the Cincinnati Reds and take him through it pitch by pitch and what would be going on inside his mind. I thought, 40 years later, I still remember that as just a brilliant article and probably the best insight I've ever seen into the mind of a pitcher.
Well, it's among Angell's greatest essays. There's no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt about it, and he recognizes the strength of that piece too, and has gone on record as saying that particular passage that you referred to was one of the great ideas that Angell, ever had as a writer. To sit down with Blass in his living room to absolve him of, or try to absolve him of, the burden of this inexplicable yips, as they're known, that descended upon him, that we suddenly couldn't throw a ball down the middle of the plate anymore. Try and lift that burden and plug him, that is Blass, back into the joy of pitching, which is something he of course loved, but also lost after being forced out of the game. And it's a very moving passage, isn't it?
Oh, exceptionally so. Go ahead.
No, just the two of them talking and Rogers sort of both encouraging him to talk, which was one of, I think, Rogers' great skills as a writer, is to listen. Mm-hmm. And then there's so much talking in his pieces. As I say in the book, it almost reads like oral history at times. But he was smart enough, especially early in his career, to let pitchers and players and managers talk. So he lets Blass talk, and you can practically see his face loosen and smile and sort of brighten up as he imagines pitching. It's a beautiful moment.
It really is, and that's just something. As you were speaking there a moment ago, Joe, I was thinking, he let people talk. I mean, you feel his presence in just about everything he writes, but it's never an obnoxious presence. He never has the conceit of thinking he's more interesting or more important than the people he's writing about. He's truly every fan, but yet the most brilliant and observant and discerning of fans.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think his innate modesty is one of the great strengths of his writing. It wasn't a lack of confidence, of course. It wasn't a modesty that interfered with his ambition at all. But you were right. He learned, especially early on, because we have to remember that he wasn't a press man. He wasn't writing for the paper, so he didn't have the press card that he could show and flash sort of and get into the clubhouses. That came later, but since he didn't consider himself a journalist, since he really wasn't, and he didn't really trust his press box skills yet. He learned to let people talk and to teach him the game. And to his great credit, that's something that Angell returned to again and again. He always tried. One of the words he uses, I mentioned this in the book, that appear countless times in his writing, from his first piece to his his speech at accepting the Spink Award at the Hall of Fame in 2013, with variations on the word startled. Mm-hmm. He is always open to being startled by the game, and one of the ways I think he's renewed that over the decades is to let the players talk to him about the game, because you and I who love this game, we know it's a humbling game. It's a very, very, very hard game, and even players at this elite level still struggle. And Roger always recognized the effectiveness and the poignancy in letting the players talk about the lows as well as the highs.
And one thing I think you brought it out, it's kind of, how could I say, almost a rueful or a mixed feeling that realizing that when he began writing about spring training in 1962, that locals, especially retirees, maybe would go to games, but spring training in Florida and Arizona in those days wasn't, frankly, the big business, the big focus that it is today, and that he realized, even though it certainly wasn't his intention, he kind of, by observing spring training, he fundamentally changed it in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah, he does half jokingly blame himself for that.
Yeah.
Because he did rave about the kind of the rustic intimacy and casualness of those early minor league seasons that the minor league seasons that he would go to in the 50s and 60s, and really they're analogous now to collegiate ball. They were played in rickety stadiums for small crowds, but then that business, the minor league business, became a multi-million-dollar business too. And like so much in the game, it changed irrevocably. And Roger has sighed about that, in the pages of the New Yorker. But he also, one of his great strengths, as I've been talking about, also is that he's not a sentimentalist. He hates goo, is the word that he uses, and so he may bemoan the loss of the old rustic minor league days, but he also recognizes that it's inevitable.
And talk a little bit about the fact, I think you made an allusion to it, but his autobiographical writings, it really hasn't been until maybe the last decade or so that he veered away from baseball, that to a degree that even though he still writes about the game, he also started doing more reflective autobiographical pieces. And what's your sense of what led him in that direction?
Yeah, I was especially pleased to see that happen as it was happening in the early aughts and the mid-aughts, because I've been interested in autobiography and memoir for a long, long time, and it was just a wonderful thing to see him write in that vein. He credits Tina Brown, who was the editor at the New Yorker for a few years, kind of a rancorous editor. She made some changes that rubbed people the wrong way, but Rogers only had good things to say about her, in part because she encouraged him to write more autobiographically, which is something he had resisted for years. I mean, you mentioned this earlier. His presence in his baseball pieces are so interesting. He's obviously there in every moment, but you rarely see the first-person pronoun in his work, and you very rarely in his early or in any of his baseball pieces learn much about his personal life, much about his private life. So it took him a while to come around, but he eventually started writing these pieces in the late 90s, early aughts, and they were collected in a book of his called Let Me Finish. Let Me Finish, that's it, thank you.
Yeah.
Which I think is going to be considered among his greatest books.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've got a friend who is a very passionate lover of baseball books, and as much as he loves all his baseball writing, really thinks Let Me Finish is his best book. I
understand that. There are days when I feel that, too. Because remember, he was, although he stopped writing fiction relatively early in his life, he always brings this fiction writer's sensibility to writing about baseball, and he turned that to his own life too. So some of the narrative scenes are brilliant. He writes about the past without nostalgia, with a real sort of anti-sentimentalist kind of view on the passage of life, and he's funny, and his sentences are beautiful and complex, and also I've detected this myself in talking with Roger for the book, but all of his colleagues, to a person, marvel at his memory, at his amazing memory, his capacity to recall the smallest details from decades ago, and just on that level alone, those essays that he wrote in Let Me Finish, and some of the later ones in This Old Man too, all the pieces are just studded with these memorable sort of narrative details, which just on that level alone, his two recent books are such a pleasure to read.
Indeed. Well, I'll say as a longtime fan, probably one of my unfulfilled dreams was maybe someday to have lunch with Roger Angell, or even better, spend an afternoon at the ballpark with him. And that'll probably never happen. But I feel like because of your book, I've had the next best thing.
Oh, I'm very happy to hear that, Claire. That's a wonderful thing to hear. Thanks.
So talk about the book was published, I guess, just last year by University of Nebraska Press, and
Yep.
How's the reception been so far?
It's been terrific, selling well as far as I know, and gotten some terrific reviews in some nice places. And I have to say, the entire process was made worthy by the very real gratitude that Roger himself expressed to me when I sent the book to him, and it ended up in his hands. He's very, very grateful for my time and my interest in writing this, and that made everything worthwhile for me. But yeah, it's gotten some nice reviews, and it was such a great opportunity to be able to visit the Hall of Fame, where he donated all of his papers, and I got to sit down for hours and hours and hours at a time looking at his old box scores and all his old game notes and manuscript notes, and I really, really got a feel for his writing process and how much hard work he's done and how committed he's been. So yeah, it's been a terrific process. The process was great to write it, and I was very happy finally to end up at Nebraska, because they have a real commitment to sports writing in general, and a really long, terrific baseball list. And all the folks there at Nebraska really, really get Roger and appreciated the book as well. So I couldn't be happier.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, as first I was excited when I heard it was going to be a book about Roger, and then when I saw it was coming from Nebraska, I said, this is a quality press. I can always count on something worthwhile, so I'm so glad it worked out. Do you think you have another baseball book in you sometime?
I was just talking about this the other day. I believe I do, but it's abstract at this moment, so I can talk about in detail, but I'm certain that I have another baseball book in me. I love the game too much, and I love writing about the game too much, so I'm sure something's going to come, yeah.
Oh, great. Well, Joe, we've got a couple of minutes left. Is there anything about the book and about Roger Angell that I haven't asked about you'd like to share with the people?
I don't think so. I just would like to say that I think one of the reasons why I felt it was important to write this book is because it's likely we're never going to see a figure like Roger again. That is somebody writing about baseball the way Roger has written about baseball. The internet in the last couple of decades have, as we know, exploded with the number of people who are writing, but also a shrinking of the size of what they write. Just the other day, or this morning, that is, I read an article online where the writer who posted it apologized for its length. We have the rise of the too long didn't read hashtag in response to long pieces, and we just aren't as I think accustomed or comfortable with long pieces anymore. And the essays that Angell wrote in the 70s and 80s, frankly, well into the 90s, are so long and so languorous and patiently explored and written that he gives an insight and a dimensionality to the game via his writing that we're likely never going to see again. So I think it's sad. Well, it's sad, but it's probably inevitable.
It is, I suppose.
Inevitable. Yeah, but that doesn't make it any less bittersweet. There's no doubt about that. But he's still around, and of course, and he's still posting. He's slowed down considerably, but he's still thinking about the game and writing about the game. We contacted each other recently about that, but it's likely that we're not going to see a Roger Angell again. In part because he was so gifted and talented that we shouldn't. That's the law of averages ago. But it's more a business thing too, and that I don't think we are as hospitable as a reading culture to 30, 40-page essays about baseball the way Roger's given us. And one of the reasons I was happy to end up in Nebraska as well is because they reissued his first two books. So it seemed like a perfect place for my book to end up. But that's a reminder that his first two books at least, are still in print, and they're well worth tracking down, because he gives us a very, very patient exploration of the game, a very pleasurable sort of long stay with the game that baseball, I think, demands, or at least encourages. But there are very, very few writers who are doing that anymore.
Sadly, that's true, but we've still got Roger for however long we can celebrate him. Oh, Joe, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for being on Claire's Corner. Joe Bonomo, author of No Place I Would Rather Be, Roger Angell, and A Life in Baseball Writing. Look for it at your local bookstore or online. Thanks again, Joe.
Thanks so much, Claire. Thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Okay, and for everybody listening, until we meet again, happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.